Hey everybody. So I wanted to introduce our next module. Module 2 contains stories that all meditate on this concept of masculinity. So this week we're going to continue discussing gender roles, except now we're looking strictly at the representation of men and of masculinity. So as you should have read on the syllabus, in this course, we will begin learning about literary theory. So, literary theory refers to philosophies of interpretation, philosophies that deal with how we interpret texts. So, there are three main ways that we will be analyzing texts this semester. We will work on a feminist critique, which we could also consider it a gender studies critique, because we're looking at not just women, we're looking at women and men and how gender is really a social construct, an idea that we all try to perform and live up to. We will also practice a Marxist critique. And in a Marxist type of critique, that's when we look at the character's social class and we think about how that character's ideas about the world and how they connect to the world are related to their social class. Lastly, we'll consider a psychoanalytic form of critique, where we look closely at what motivates the characters, about their psychology, and in particular, how trauma affects a character's perceptions and behavior, like what we see in the novel Beloved by Toni Morrison. In that novel, the characters Setha and Paul D all cope with the trauma of being enslaved at a plantation, and we see how that affects their memory and affects their behavior in the present day of the novel. So we will continue our exploration really of gender studies by looking at two stories this week that present an image of what it means to be a young man. So last week we looked at the representations of the patriarchy and how genders are socially constructed. In Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, for instance, we see a list of all the rules and all the behavior that a girl must follow in order to be a lady. In the two stories for this week, we see how the idea of a man is also socially constructed, and we see how young men struggle to meet those expectations of manhood. Richard Wright's story, The Man Who Was Almost a Man, is about a young man named Dave who wants to be free of his parents' authority to make his own decisions. That leads him to want to buy a gun. The idea of wielding a gun is something Dave seems to fetishize or obsess about, believing that having that gun would make him a man or would really change how he is perceived. Dave's ideas about manhood, however, don't really hold water. When he accidentally shoots Jenny, Dave ultimately does not face consequences of his actions. And so in that sense, he's not quite a man because he doesn't fully take responsibility. As you read the story, think about the ways that Dave is, like in the title, almost a man, but not quite. Then turn to a more recent work. Richard Wright's story is from 1961. Turn to a more recent work by T. Corrigeson Boyle called Greasy Lake that was written in the 1980s. Be warned that there is an attempted sexual assault in this story. So if you cannot read the story, there is another story by Boyle that also references the idea of masculinity, and that one's called Are We Not Men? You may read that story if you choose. So make sure you specify which of Boyle's stories you're discussing when you do your discussion board post. I would prefer that you read Greasy Lake, but if you cannot because of the sexual assault there, then just read the other one. Or read both of them because they're both really good stories. So in Greasy Lake, we hear of a wild night out a young teenage boy's wild night out, and how being a young man means being bad and means pushing the limits of acceptable behavior. As you read this, think about how the narrator may have understood manhood at this time of his life. Also, how do these supposedly masculine traits become destructive? Look for examples of that in the reading. Do you see anything here that would qualify as toxic masculinity? In the story Are We Not Men, we also see how manhood implies managing a destructive tendency. Whichever of Boyle's stories you choose, think about how characters have different ideas about what makes a man, and how each of the stories teaches a different lesson about manhood. I look forward to reading your thoughts on the discussion board. Speaking of which, I've graded all the discussion board posts from last week. Some of you did not respond to a classmate's post, and that is an important part of the discussion grade, and it is required. We don't have, a set time during the week to discuss these readings, so it's important that we engage with each other through the discussion board. It's also a good exercise to prepare you for the critical response essays that will be coming up. Our first one will be next week. So, the critical response essay is 750 words minimum, and you must focus on one of the readings thus far. So read over that assignment so you can start to think about which reading you'd like to choose. Next Tuesday, I will go over that assignment in more detail, so make sure you take a look at it beforehand so you can start thinking about it. Remember also that if you have any questions about the reading, you can bring it up in the discussion board post. There may be other students with that same question, and it's important we discuss it all together. I'm also always available via email at ssokowski@desu.edu. I'll see you on the discussion board.